Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories Podcast. I'm your host, John DeLynn. It is September 28th, 2018, and I could not be more excited for today's interview. Those of you who have been listening to Mormon Stories for a long time will remember interviews that I had with people like Richard Bushman, Grant Palmer, Brent Metcalf, Michael Quinn, where we interviewed, top-notch Mormon historians who really made contributions to understanding Mormon history and the Mormon narrative. Today, I have someone who I think is definitely as important to hear as any of those other authors. Her name is Kathleen Melonakos, and this is her book. The book is Secret Combinations, Evidence of Early Mormon Counterfeiting, 1800 to 1847. And some of you are aware of this book because it's been talked about quite a bit on Reddit, the ex-Mormon Reddit, and I've talked about it on my Facebook wall as well. But this is a really cool book. The premise of this book, or one of the main foci of this book, is to talk about, Kathleen's deep investigation into the extent to which she feels, the counterfeiting of currency was intertwined with the founding of Mormonism, with Joseph Smith, with his family, and with the early leaders of the Mormon Church. We will be touching on that today, but that's not the core purpose of this interview. My vision for this interview is a little bit more creative. What I want to do is bring on 3 or 4 top-notch historians who know about Mormonism and give each of them a chance to explain their version in a chronological way of how Mormonism came to be, sort of to provide the historical context for the life of the Smith family, for Joseph Smith, for the early things that happened that led to the Book of Mormon, and then the founding of the church, and then everything that kind of came later. So in this case, it's going to be Kathleen Melonakos' historical context and understanding of the founding of Mormonism. And it's going to be cool. We're going to do several hours. I probably will want to bring her back at some point to go into more depth because this is going to be an overview, but this book deserves a lot more attention. But anyway, that's what we're doing, and I'm super excited to have you joining us today, Kathleen. So welcome to Mormon Stories Podcast.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be here today.
Yeah, so good job on this book.
Oh, thank you. It was a lot of work. And I will say that I built on a lot of the scholarship that already has been done. So many early Mormon documents are available now. Dan Vogel having done a tremendous amount of publishing of early Mormon documents just the way they appeared. And of course, Gerald and Sandra Tanner have been doing that their whole lives. And yes, Grant Palmer helped me out. He guided me along. I got so much help from some of those same historians that you just mentioned.
Yeah, and so that's, Dan Vogel, I've never had on Mormon Stories. That's an egregious omission on my part. I want to bring him on and do this. I want to bring on Sandra and do this. Maybe bring on Brent Metcalf. Maybe you listeners can recommend a few other historians. But we're going to go through this exercise with 3 or 4 or 5 Mormon historians and do the same thing, their version of how it all happened. There will be overlap, but I think everybody's going to bring a different bit of insight. And if we want to bring in a faithful historian or two, maybe Brian Hales, if I have the fortitude and patience to interview him, or someone like it, we're willing to bring on faithful Mormon historians and do the same sort of thing. But anyway, let's begin, shall we? So before we actually dive into the book itself, let's do like a 5-minute version of your history as it relates to Mormonism. So I know that's really brief, right?
Well, before we do that, can I just say one thing about methodology?
Sure.
And historians, as most of the great historians have said, must rely on the original documents. The primary sources must tell the story, and then you examine those, and then you tell the story based on those, not on what somebody said they said, but what, so that's what I did. I looked at those. Okay, so my 5-minute version, if I can do that. The Smith family were already involved in counterfeiting.
Oh, wait. Sorry. What I mean is your story. So you have pioneer heritage. Let's just talk quickly about you, just to give people a background of who you are.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yes. My heritage goes back to the founding of the Mormon Church on both of my parents' side. My father was Heber C. Kimball IV. His wing of the Kimball family kept practicing polygamy up after the manifesto, and so he was raised in a group, several of the polygamy groups. He left that early on in his life to marry my mother, who was, her side of the family went back to Thomas Grover, who was Brigham Young's right-hand man, one of them. Well, of course, Heber C. Kimball was too. So I was raised in a very active Mormon family, but there was this background of my father's family too, and it was all very secret. And so when I found out more about it in my early youth, I wanted to know what was this all about with polygamy, because I had been told the regular Mormon story, the mainline, whatever you call it, about it. So I started questioning, and my husband and I were married in the temple. We were active Mormons up until like 1 or 2 years after we had been married in the temple at age 20. And that is me. He was 23. But we moved away to Michigan, and we had the opportunity there to explore more, you might say, and, go into the actual intellectual basis for Mormonism. And there's a long story about it, and you can read it on my website if you want more of my personal story. But we left the church early.
Around what year?
Around 1977.
Okay, so you figured some of this stuff out.
We've been married about 2 years.
You figured some of this stuff out quite early.
Yes, we did. And so we looked for decades as to, what we actually did believe is true. And that was a long journey. That's a whole thing in itself also. But when we moved to California, I read Martha Beck's book.
Leaving the Saints?
Yes. And in there she disclosed that her father had plagiarized a lot of his footnotes.
This is Hugh Nibley.
Hugh Nibley, the foremost scholar of Mormonism, when we were at BYU and later. So I said, I wonder what else is falsified. And that piqued my curiosity, and I started really wondering what had really happened in the Mormon Church. And so I looked into polygamy more. I looked into the in depth, and so many things were available at this time. And you have the internet. You can look on archive.org for old books. You don't even have to go to the archives, but I did go to a lot of archives. And I just started, and Sandra Tanner published a story about Joseph Smith loving to read this about Stephen Burroughs and reading the book about that had been written by Stephen Burroughs. I said, I wonder who this character is that he liked reading about. And it turned out he was a major counterfeiter that posed as a preacher. So that really got my curiosity going, and I started studying about counterfeiting in early America, and it just led into this whole picture that started forming. And reading books about polygamy and church history, there are many footnotes and side notes about counterfeiting, but nobody had formulated or figured out that this was a lot bigger story of the Mormon story than has been acknowledged. So I just felt it was my duty and my task to put it all together. And I worked at it for 8.5 years.
This book?
Doing the research for it, yes, and putting it together and.
And you have a graduate degree from Stanford, is that right?
Yes, I do. We lived in the Palo Alto area when they opened up a new master's program, and I immediately applied. I thought it was a great opportunity, and I was able to be accepted. And so I studied lots of history, philosophy, liberal arts, and I did my master's degree in philosophy. I studied the ancient philosophers, American pragmatism, and so I learned how to be trained in logical thinking and evaluating truth claims, how to tell when something's true or false, how to apply that in your life and use that, because if you make mistakes in logic and reasoning, it's going to hurt you. So, I mean, it may or may not, but usually it is going to be a mistake that can be, detrimental. So I did my master's on philosophy.
So in the words of Jeffrey Holland, you've been to a pretty good school.
Well, I was very blessed to be able to do that. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So that's super useful. So let's just dive into your version of kind of the historical context that led to the Book of Mormon. Maybe I'll just set it up really briefly. Is that okay? Mm-hmm. When I was just starting to question church history and trying to really understand it, the way that I was thinking about it was, oh my gosh, the Book of Mormon is so amazing and it's so powerful, it's so creative and it's so innovative. There's just no way that Joseph Smith or some farm boy yokel could have written it. Mm-hmm. And I think that's kind of what general authorities and apologists often try and say these days. They try and just say the book's too amazing, it's had too much of big of an influence, it's too complex, it's too sophisticated. There's just no way some farm boy could have written it. Once I read Grant Palmer's book and he started explaining about Joseph's own personal narrative, about the Old and New Testament and how it was brought into the Book of Mormon, about the Masonic stuff that was going on that becomes the secret combination stuff in the Book of Mormon. When he talks about the preachers that were going around preaching sermons that then sort of became, let's just say, King Benjamin's speeches or Alma the Younger speeches or whatever. He starts explaining all these potential, in view of the Hebrews, and you learn about that. And it starts sort of painting a different picture where you're starting to go, oh my gosh, now the Book of Mormon has gone from this miracle that could have never been created by any other means than divine inspiration. It flips to, oh my gosh, now that I see the historical context for the environment that Joseph Smith was swimming in, you would almost expect something like the Book of Mormon to come out of that context. And that's kind of what this is about. So now I want you to begin, and we'll do this for a few hours. I want you to set the stage for the contextual historical items that you believe are important in understanding how Joseph Smith came to be, how the Book of Mormon came to be, how the Mormon Church came to be, and some of the interesting events that followed. So where would you want to begin painting that historical context?
Yeah, that's a tough thing. I guess I could just kind of give a brief overview.
Well, let's just start with your outline, and let's just dig in. So you begin by talking about the radical origins of Mormonism, and I think that's a good place to start.
Right. Well, I might preface that by saying, the counterfeiting was a main motivation for doing the whole thing, the whole what people call the Counterfeit Bible, and that's what it is. Because we know, like you say, we can trace the 19th century sources from which it came. He lifted it right out of different 19th century sources. So, now you have to, as you say, we have to consider the context in which this all came about. Early America, 6 generations from the Mayflower. There were 2 groups in America that founded colonies, the Mayflower Pilgrims, who were separatists who wanted to separate from England, Church of England, who did not have an ordained minister, and the Puritans, who came 10 years later. So these were 2 different groups, Puritans and Pilgrims. Puritans were educated. They were from Cambridge. They knew the languages of the original Bible. They knew Hebrew and Greek. They had, John Winthrop. They had educated ministers who were licensed to preach from the Bible. And this was in the midst of the Great Reformation the Protestant Reformation. England had broken away from Spain, from the Catholic Church. This is not that long after Henry VIII had done that. Elizabeth I had provided good leadership. Then James I was not as politically talented. He did commission the King James Bible, which was very significant because then they were definitely Protestant and they could read from the Bible themselves.
The people.
Yes, the people and the ministers. So that it led to a lot of controversies in England, and that's a reason why a lot of the settlers came to America, to have the religious freedom. But now the Puritans have been reputed to be the ancestors of the Mormons, the ones that wanted to stick with the Bible. But that isn't true. Leonard Arrington said they were descended from the Puritans, but they were from the Pilgrims. And my grandmother even said, she has the records of how we're descended from people that came over in the Mayflower. Well, they were not as strictly biblical as the Puritans. And in fact, there were other radical sects besides the one that eventually the Pilgrims ended up forming in England. There were the Muggletonians, there were the Quakers, there were different groups that wanted to get away from strict interpretation of the Bible according to the Hebrew and Greek, and they wanted to call themselves prophets. So those people tended to settle in certain areas of the United States. So Michael Quinn did a very extensive study of where the Mormons came from. He did one, and so did Val Rust. They came from radical towns in New England, Exeter, Massachusetts, Litchfield, Connecticut, and they were all connected by family and kinship, and they kept in touch with each other when they moved forward. So Joseph Smith had a cousin named Ransford Rogers, who turned out to be a major swindler, but he was related to the man that founded the Rogerines, and it was one of the most radically dissenting radical sects.
And just so that our listeners really understand, condense for us in a quick statement why it's important to associate early Mormonism more with Pilgrims than Puritans.
Because they believe the
Pilgrims.
The Pilgrims did not have a educated, ordained minister, so they pretty well drifted away from being biblically centered. And there was always this culture war. There were the evangelical Christians that wanted to stay and form a biblical commonwealth, as there had been in Europe, like Geneva, the city on a hill, and that's where we get that phrase. And then there were the other ones who wanted to set up their own kind of community or society or sect that where they, instead of following the Bible, they followed their prophet, and which many times they would get a revelation, and there were certain things that they had in common. They always had a prophet or someone who headed it up, and they demanded strict obedience of their followers. They did away with the, scripture mandate to follow the Bible, and they oftentimes instead went into occult activities, into counterfeiting. It was a way to cover up what they were doing that was illegal. It was illegal in early America to delve into the occult, to do treasure hunting, to do fortune telling and witchcraft and all that kind of thing.
Got it. So if I can summarize, when we think about like Billy Graham and sort of hardcore evangelical Christians of today that tend to be professional ministers and are really focused on the Bible, that's not Mormonism, right?
No.
That's another major strain of Christianity that we associate today with like evangelical Christianity. To understand how Mormonism came to be, you need to understand the Pilgrim version of Christianity, which de-emphasizes the Bible. We have that in the Articles of Faith, right? The Bible is true as long as it's translated correctly. We have Joseph Smith's words being much more important than whatever's in the Bible. But most importantly, we have these leaders without the formal training rising up, creating these congregations and followers, emphasizing obedience. And then we have intermingling of superstition and the occult activities and even charlatan-like behaviors. That's all behavior consistent coming out of the Pilgrim tradition. Is that what you're saying?
Well, it wasn't in the beginning. I mean, there were...
Descendants of.
Yeah, it drifted that way over some, years.
So that's a really important contextual foundation for understanding Mormonism, to understand it growing out of the descendants of the Pilgrim traditions, let's just say.
Right.
Okay, that's good. Mm-hmm. All right, so where do we go from there?
So you have this group of people that were all originated back in Litchfield, Connecticut. And the Mormon story is that Oliver Cowdery and Joseph Smith met each other in May of 1829, and that is really false. I mean, there were Cowdery cousins living in Tunbridge, Vermont when the Smiths moved there. Joseph Smith Sr. and Lucy were married in 1796. So going back to at least that far, in Tunbridge, Vermont, there were Cowdery cousins. They probably attended their wedding because we know as of 1800, people observed Joseph Smith Sr. and William Cowdery to be involved in this group called the Woodscrape Group, or the New Israelites. So we know their families knew each other at least as far back as 1800.
And before we dive into that, it seems like understand. So, okay, let me be candid about your book for just a second in one way. So obviously I have you on because I love your book. One of the things I feel like you're trying to do is break new ground with explaining why understanding counterfeiting is important for understanding early Mormonism. Is that I mean?
Yeah.
And I personally, I don't care so much about the extent to which actual counterfeiting was being done within Mormonism. And I don't feel the need to convince listeners that it was or wasn't happening so much. What I did really find valuable is to understand how the culture that was behind counterfeiting seems to be an important cultural influence for what became Mormonism. Is that true? Mm-hmm. So let's, before we talk about the Cowdery-Smith connection, maybe talk to us briefly about, as in your outline, it says that the nature of counterfeiting in America. Talk about why that's an important context to help inform our understanding of the founding of Mormonism.
Well, there's a whole subculture that evolved or that arose with counterfeiting and these radical sects. Of course, it was a serious crime, especially in England. People went to the gallows regularly for counterfeiting the coin of the realm.
Meaning they were killed?
Yes, they were executed by the king or the queen because governments have long known that if you don't have control over the currency, it impairs the whole economy. And it was used as a weapon of war in the Revolutionary War, the British against the Patriots. They made massive amounts of the Continental Congress money that they had formed, and it was kind of warfare during the Revolutionary War, right? If you don't have a sound medium of exchange, you can't pay your soldiers. You can't have trade. It impairs the ability to collect taxes. You can't run your country. So if it was also used in World War II and other times, but the government has to have a sound currency. So here we are in early America, and the Revolutionary War happens. There's a lack of government, and there's questionable jurisdiction in many parts of the colonies now that they've won their independence. And whose jurisdiction is it? Who is supposed to print the currency. There were banks that were set up, and the whole system rested on gold and silver. You had a certain amount of gold and silver, and then the bank that took care of that, you were able to write a bank note on that particular bank, but it made it easy to counterfeit. And the whole banking system and currency system was it was somewhat in disarray, but it was a serious crime to counterfeit the particular banknotes. And yes, it was considered a crime. And it was often connected with horse stealing. But this was, from the time of the American Revolution up at least until Andrew Jackson and beyond, that's why it was considered the Wild Wild West. On the frontier, the more settled areas, the law and order prevailed, and you could, there were counterfeiters that posed as respectable citizens and got away with it in some cases for sometimes years. But then it would always cause a huge furor when they were found out, and it was similar a little bit to drug dealing. I would compare it to, it was somewhat common. There were people that did it, but it was disreputable, and you could go to jail, you could be hung. But one thing about the nature of counterfeiting also I have to mention. You couldn't do it alone. You had to have a large number of secretly oath-bound people. And that's why I call my book Secret Combinations, because there were different, secret groups in early America. And if you were engaged in this illegal activity, often connected with horse stealing, you had to, swear against the Bible, I can't believe they used the Bible, but they would swear upon pain of death that they would not reveal their compatriots that were complicit in this crime.
And the reason why you needed multiple people, so the opportunity of counterfeiting was to make a ton of money, right? To get rich. It's kind of a shortcut to wealth.
Exactly.
But you needed a lot of people. And the reason you needed a lot of people, talk about all the different roles that people would play that were needed for this kind of oath-bound group to succeed. Have the capital, the printing press, what would be needed?
Well, it evolved over time, with the development of the printing press. But by the time that Joseph and Hyrum Smith were coming to prominence, a printing press was a large instrument. If you were going to print up paper money, a printing press was a large instrument, made up of metal that was not easy to transport. It could easily cost $2,000, which was a huge amount of money back then. So if you were going to invest in that, you had to have somebody that could procure a printing press, for one thing, or you had to have someone that was skilled in metallurgy to make coins. And so you had to have somebody procure that, which would provide the leadership. So someone had to coordinate it all, because you had to have a large printing press. You had someone skilled in printing, someone who was good at forging names on the banknotes. You had to have someone who could
signatures, right?
Yeah, signatures. You had forgers. There were a lot of forgery, involved, with these banknotes. And you had to have someone to procure the engraving plates. That was pretty complicated. And usually that was from a normal bank. You had to have some sly clerk that could surreptitiously obtain them from a legitimate bank. And then you had to have a place to do all this, to print up the money back in the swamps or away from the law enforcement. And then you had to have distributors. So someone to take it out. You print up all this money, and you can't spend it all in one place in your little town. You had to send it out all to different receivers across the country. And there were these large networks that covered many states. And so the receivers would receive the counterfeit money, exchange it for good money, or they deal in it, and then there were people that passed it on to landowners or horse dealers, and another important thing was it was often connected with horse stealing, because you could print up a lot of counterfeit money, buy a lot of horses with it, and then sell the horses for good money in another locale. And so, you had peddlers that were distributors of counterfeit money, and Joseph Smith Sr. was said to be a peddler in Vermont, and Oliver Cowdery was a peddler. But you needed all these, what they called boodle carriers, bogus distributors, to be all over the country. So some of the biggest counterfeiting rings had 400, 500 people. There were other counterfeiting rings, that we can trace, we can see what they did. So you had to have all the players.
Right. And so for me, what was really important or interesting, because I've always thought, well, Joseph Smith wrote the Book of Mormon, and he did it alone, and how did he do it? And he's just an uneducated farm boy. He couldn't even write. But the Book of Mormon's so complex and marvelous, it must be a miracle. But what this discussion of counterfeiting helped me understand, and tell me if I'm understanding it right, is another way to look at the Book of Mormon is that just like these groups of men or women would get together and through blood oaths make promises to organize and protect and maintain some sort of corrupt cabal to perpetuate something like counterfeiting, why wouldn't it very much be possible for Joseph Smith, with Hyrum, with Oliver Cowdery, with Sidney Rigdon, maybe even Joseph's dad, the other brothers that were witnesses,
the Johnson brothers,
but also the 3 and 8 witnesses, the Whitmers, right?
Yeah, Whitmer.
Why we know that blood oaths were a part of Mormonism. We know that was baked into the temple ceremony. Right. A lot of people wonder, well, how could the witnesses have all kept their stories? Why didn't Oliver Cowdery and the Whitmers end up turning on Joseph Smith and revealing that he was a fraud? Well, the answer would be if there was some sort of oath-bound promise or covenant made at the very start, we're going to be creating this book, and part of the promise that we're all making is we'll make it together, but we're never going to ever reveal sort of, how it actually came to be. Then all of a sudden, this organizational structure that either Masonry or counterfeiting would sort of have, informed potentially Mormonism, it makes sense that maybe that was adopted for the early founding of Mormonism. Am I explaining that right?
Oh, yes. And, well, they said themselves that they held a lot of secret meetings while they were writing the Book of Mormon. Lucy said that. She said, well... And
we'll get to that. We're going to get to that.
Yeah.
But for you and for me, understanding the culture of blood oath groups that carried on counterfeiting provides an important contextual understanding for thinking about how likely the Book of Mormon and ultimately the Mormon Church came to be.
Right.
Is that fair?
Because they had been practicing doing that for quite a long time by the time they wrote the Book of Mormon.
And many of Joseph's ancestors seem to be involved or implicated in these sorts of blood oath groups.
Yes.
So let's talk about Stephen Burrows, because I think that gives a good example. Is that okay?
Yeah. Well, I have a chapter called The Seeds of Mormonism Were Sown in Vermont. And so do you want me to?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay.
Because it gives a good example of like if Joseph Smith Sr., Joseph Smith Jr., Hyrum, Oliver were paying attention, they would have learned from other people. They would have gotten ideas from other people
Right.
as to what they might do later.
Exactly.
So that's where this comes into play.
So there were characters in Vermont that they borrowed their ideas from.
And that's where Joseph Smith was born, right? Sharon, Vermont, 1804?
1805,
1805,
Sharon, Vermont.
okay, right.
And yeah, Joseph Sr. and Lucy lived there for at least 10 years, from 1796 to 1816. And they lived in the vicinity of Dartmouth College. And this was on the frontier at that time. This was way out in the fringes. And so they weren't...
Where counterfeiting flourished.
Counterfeiting.
And strange religious movements, right?
Exactly. And so, but Dartmouth College was founded in 1769. And it turns out, we find out, that one of the main founders of it and developers of its curriculum was Professor John Smith, who they had most likely known, well, they had to have known him back in Massachusetts, the Smiths, that is, before they moved to Vermont. But he was...
Was he related to Joseph Smith Sr.?
Yes, Joseph Smith Sr., it was his grandfather's, Joseph and Hyrum's grandfather, Asel Smith, was his cousin. So Professor John Smith and Asel Smith were cousins. So this professor at Dartmouth, and he was gifted very early on in his life and given a scholarship to study at Yale, I believe it was. But he learned the ancient languages that the Bible's written in: Hebrew, Greek, Chaldaic, some other ancient languages. Very skilled in that, and he developed curriculum at Dartmouth, including these lectures where he wandered away from the Bible into his own speculations. And Dartmouth College was founded as the school of the prophets, but in the Old Testament, it was the prophet always told about the coming Messiah, and in the New Testament, the word prophet meant people who witnessed or talked or had knowledge of the Messiah. And then after that, the word always meant, at least to biblically trained ministers, and it was only used, the word prophet at the time of the founding of Dartmouth meant someone who expounded on the Bible. So the school of the prophets. But in Vermont, there was this movement after the American Revolution to be rebellious. The whole country had defied the authority of the British Crown and the Church of England, that was the main church. So there was this kind of movement, and Stephen Burroughs was one of the main harbingers of this kind of rebellious anti-hero movement, where his father, Eden Burroughs, was one of the major board of trustees ministers at Dartmouth as well, but he defied his father and became a major counterfeiter that posed as a minister.
So we were talking about John Smith,
right,
and all of a sudden we jumped to Stephen Burroughs and Eden Burroughs.
Because there are four main people in Vermont that I believe that you can trace their similar ideas to, that influenced the Mormons, the early Mormon people who created Mormonism. Professor John Smith, because he speculated, he was the one that had the idea of the preexistence.
Yeah, and this is, for me, was the most powerful part of the book. So is this the part to talk about that on page 69 of your book, right?
Yeah, you can do that. If
were we going to talk about it later?
Well, he came up with other speculations, but that were extra biblical. But he came up with that idea among others.
And we'll talk about him because he ends up tying to Hyrum Smith, that ends up tying to Joseph, right?
Right.
But this is a guy who gave these lectures at Dartmouth, and you have Dartmouth alumnus Richard K. Barron summarizing his lectures as containing ideas like a concept of a preexistence, an atonement covenant that was made before the earth was, the plan of salvation being agreed to in the preexistence,
Father,
Son, and sons of men together in the preexistence. Spiritual death as a condition after the fall was man's condition after the fall. The church would exist in all ages after the fall. Oaths and covenants serve as the deity's legal structure. Light, borrowed light, and the light of reason would guide. Melchizedek priesthood as co-eternal with God.
Right, that.
The priesthood as the source of the son's authority. Aaronic priesthood promised to Aaron's descendants. Free agency and the right to choose is integral to the plan. Degrees of glory is the structure of the eternities. Consecration to Christ is required for highest exaltation. Revelation required to know the ultimate nature of God. Spirit is a simpler form of matter. The prosperity cycle, even, that's found in the Book of Mormon later, is the natural direction of history. Millions of peopled worlds.
Yeah.
Father argues for justice and son argues for mercy. Now, I think there are a lot of us that want to see the original source documents that make up this outline that you put together. But if this bears out as true, and I have friends who are going to Dartmouth partly because of your book and trying to find the original source documents that inform this outline. But if that's true, what you've just shown us is sort of almost the founding theology of both Mormonism and the Book of Mormon. You found the source for that.
Yeah.
So if John Smith was teaching this at Dartmouth, and then Hyrum goes to John Smith and learns these things, comes to Joseph and talks to Joseph about it, we have now identified the primary theological sources for all of Joseph's, quote, innovations, or all of the Book of Mormon's, quote, innovations. Instead of it being this miracle, instead of it being this amazing doctrinal advancement in Christianity, we see another primary source that Joseph literally plagiarized or counterfeited and infused into the Book of Mormon, kind of like biblical fan fiction, where he's just grabbing masonry, he's grabbing the stuff of John Smith, he's grabbing stuff from the view of the Hebrews, and he's sort of munging all that into the Book of Mormon. Now, we're getting ahead of ourselves, but I'm just making sure that people understand why you've invoked the name John Smith.
Well, I had a long conversation with Richard Behrens, who did a huge amount of research at Dartmouth. He was a Dartmouth alumni, so he was very familiar with all the records of Dartmouth. He was a former Mormon. He wanted to trace what had gone on at Dartmouth. So he had said, he told me, he had viewed this biography that his wife still has possession of and the original lectures. You can go back and see what the curriculum was at Dartmouth at the time. And Hyrum Smith attended Dartmouth, the prep school, from 1811 to 1813. And he may well have had his notes. Professor John Smith died in 1810, but his curriculum, Hyrum Smith would have listened to it day after day. And he attended those Presbyterian meetings. And so he learned a whole lot about how a church is structured, what they do in Presbyterian meetings, And he probably he may well have had his notes when they moved to New York and Palma in 1816.
And it would have been things the Smith family talked about.
Yeah.
So now I get why Vermont, Dartmouth, and John Smith are so important to understand if you want to understand the historical context that informs Joseph Smith and eventually the Book of Mormon.
Well, Who are
the others?
Yeah, so you got John Smith, and then Stephen Burroughs. His father was on the board of trustees there.
Okay, so that's the Edmund? Eden. So Eden Burroughs is important because he was a contemporary with John Smith at Dartmouth.
Yes, and his son.
And he was respectable. Eden was respectable.
He was the main pastor of the church there as well.
But then his son comes along as kind of a ne'er-do-good, right? He's an apple that falls a little bit far from the tree.
He became one of the most notorious criminals of that era, of the early 1800s.
Okay, so let's talk about him.
So he became very well known. We don't know him today, scholars do, but he early on rebelled and played all kinds of pranks, tricks, practical jokes, and actually stole things. And he was accepted, went to Dartmouth for 2 years, but got kicked out his second year. So he learned the language. He became very skilled at language skills. And then he wrote a best-selling book called Memoirs. But this was after he had escaped at age 19 stole some of his father's sermons and went to Pelham, Massachusetts, posed as a preacher, fooled the people for months, and then meanwhile, he's learning all the tricks of counterfeiting and setting up this huge counterfeiting network. And so he had already escaped across the border to Canada when his book came out, the memoirs. And in the book, he apologized. By that I mean he defended his life of crime that he was already in. He said, there's nothing wrong with counterfeiting money. You can, he was very persuasive, but he defended his life of crime. Prior to that time, he didn't do that. But he was charming. He was very persuasive, and he was seen as kind of an kind of a folk hero by some. That he was able to get away with these crimes, even though the authorities wanted to arrest him, and they did numerous times. But he always escaped, and he had his whole family involved in his counterfeiting. His sons would spring him from jail, and this was the time when law enforcement wasn't very adequate. So he flooded New England with counterfeit notes and banknotes, especially Vermont and New Hampshire, where his father was teaching. And of course, there was huge talk about his best-selling book, The Memoirs, at Dartmouth in 1811 when Hyrum was there. So we know that there was, that they knew him, that they were exposed to his ideas. And Pomeroy Tucker, even in Palmyra, New York, said that Joseph Smith loved reading stories about this character and reading
Stephen Burrows.
About Stephen Burrows.
So
Yeah.
There's evidence that Stephen Burrows writes this biography kind of bragging about his life of crime and deception that was both around counterfeiting but also religious intertwining.
Right.
Is that right?
He claimed to be a pious Christian preacher, but of course he wasn't. He was a fake person that made a mockery of it, really, when he's doing counterfeiting on the side. And even when people found out that he wasn't a authentic preacher, he threw it back on them and said, "Oh, well, didn't you like my preaching?" He would make up all kinds of things that weren't from the Bible. And
so your theory, just to really tie this to Mormonism, what are the main ways you believe Stephen Burrows probably influenced the Smith family and Joseph Smith? Just it's like 3 or 4 or 5 things. How do you think Stephen Burrows' work may have informed the context that produced Joseph Smith, the Book of Mormon, and Mormonism?
Well, he wrote
writing a book.
Well, he posed as a preacher and did counterfeiting money.
So being a
on the
preacher, being a religious leader
was number one. Okay. And then he wrote a best-selling book that made a lot of money.
Made a lot of money.
And influenced a lot of people. He
became a folk hero.
Right, and he influenced other people to do the same thing. There were other criminals that kind of bragged about their crimes, rogue narratives we call them now. And so this kind of proliferated. Henry Tufts was another one that did that. Ransford Rogers, he wrote a book he was a major swindler, and he wrote a book calling himself a prophet. But of course he was, he was making a mockery of, what Christian preachers did. So
Joseph Smith would have gotten the ideas to make money off a book, to be a religious leader, and to be involved in counterfeiting-like activities.
At the same time.
All of those things could have been informed by his learning about
he saw that he had
Stephen
gotten
Burrows.
away with it, and So this is a major influence, I think.
Yeah, so as the Smith family is like eventually ending up in New York, poor as dirt, trying to just survive on the frontier, not able to make the mortgage, trying to think about how do I make money, eventually the ideas of writing a book, of starting a church, and of having counterfeit-like behaviors inform the work you do. Joseph could have gotten all that from someone like Stephen Burrows.
Stephen Burrows and, of course, Solomon Spaulding.
Right.
Now, he was a very important person in history of Mormonism, too. And there has been the theory that they plagiarized his book, which most people think, most scholars disagree that they directly plagiarized the Solomon Spaulding manuscript because they're too different. They found the actual manuscript, but Solomon Spaulding had become alienated, you could say, from both Christianity and Masonry. And see this, just to back up a little, a lot of Professor John Smith's ideas had come out of Masonry, and there was this big culture war at Dartmouth between the Orthodox Christians and the deist Masons. And you can read all that in my book, too. That's a kind of long story, but Solomon Spaulding was disaffected from the Masons and the Christians, and he was no longer able to preach because he went off too far in the unorthodox doctrine. So he had the idea that he could make a lot of money, just like Stephen Burrows had, his classmate, by writing a spurious history and have it be believed by all but the most learned historians. He said, well, I'm going to take Ethan Smith's idea, who was also a classmate. So these four people were all at Dartmouth. John Smith, Ethan Smith, who wrote View of the Hebrews, the main idea that the Native Americans had come from the Old World and were related to the Jews. Stephen Burrows and his father, Eden Burrows, and then Solomon Spaulding. So, and this was right at the time when Joseph Smith Sr. and Lucy lived in that vicinity, and their son went to that college, and so did their nephew. So they would have been having all these ideas percolate around them. And Solomon Spaulding boasted that he could make this spurious history and it would be believed. And Joseph Smith Sr. was quoted by the Green Mountain Boys in 1844 as saying that he made the very same boast as Spaulding. He could write a spurious history and have it be believed by all but the most learned historians.
So maybe we misunderstood the importance of someone like an Ethan Smith or Solomon Spaulding, because what apologists would say is, oh, well, you compare the Book of Mormon and View of the Hebrews, and it's clearly not a plagiarism. Or even Fawn Brody said she didn't believe that the Book of Mormon was in any way a plagiarism or a stealing of one of Solomon Spaulding's manuscripts. But that's kind of taking us off the trail. The trail is, where in the world would Joseph get an idea to author a book like the Book of Mormon?
Right.
And it seems like he was swimming in other attempts at writing a fiction, I like to call it biblical fan fiction, but basically relying on the fact that everyone was thinking about the Bible, everyone was believing in the Bible, everyone was studying the Bible, everyone was exposed to Native Americans, everyone was believing in the 6,000-year earth, everyone was believing in the Tower of Babel and the scattering of the children of Israel and trying to wonder where are the other tribes of Israel. It would make perfect sense for Joseph and others to sort of say, Solomon Spaulding wrote a book, Ethan Smith wrote a book, even Stephen Burrows wrote a book. Maybe one way to make money is to try and do a better job at what Ethan Smith and Solomon Spaulding did, and to try and write that book that so far hasn't been super successful, but maybe I'll be the one that makes it successful.
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, New Englanders were book reading people. They were pretty well educated. They loved reading books. I mean, bookstores were common, libraries, pamphlets, all kinds of. So yeah, it would have been very lucrative, and I don't think that they plagiarized exactly Solomon Spaulding's manuscript, and many people have said it would have been a better book had Sidney Rigdon or somebody else written, or had Solomon Spaulding even written. No, the Smith family took all these ideas. They synthesized, they made a mixture of these ideas into their own, what they called a history.
Got it.
So.
Okay. So that's why it's important to understand. Anything else you want to tell us about Stephen Burrows and what he did, or does that kind of give us the...
Well, he started out as someone who looked in his magic stone to find stolen or lost property. That's how he started out in his life of crime. It was not a new trick that Joseph Smith invented either.
So, and we're going to go next to the money digging. You're saying that Joseph Smith would have gotten the ideas about money digging at least partially from reading Stephen Burrows' biography?
Well, at least partially, but the money digging was actually more borrowed from a man named Ransford Rogers, who was but
Burrows was involved in that kind of stuff too.
Well, yes, because it was a trick that counterfeiters used. William Challoner in England started out doing, the stone seeing as well. You would go out on the frontier where people, would fall for, maybe they're superstitious, whatever. Steal the property, hide it somewhere, and then charge them a fee for looking in your magic stone and telling them where it was.
Find the lost property.
Oh, thank you. That'll be $50 for finding for finding your stolen property that you had stolen in the first place.
So that was a scam.
It was a scam that there were laws against it. Being a disorderly person and imposter was often connected with doing that. And that's what Joseph Smith got arrested for in 1826. But it was not a new trick. Stephen Burrows started out doing that too.
Okay.